Have you ever heard of the old lady and the disobedient donkey? Be careful, because this story might be scary, and what happened to the donkey could very well happen to you too. Once upon a time, there was a very kind old lady who lived on a farm, surrounded by many animals. Among them all, her favorite was a little donkey named Benedito. He lived a life full of love and care. Mrs. Camilla gave him the best meals and even sang him to sleep at night. But over time, Benedito began to think he no longer needed to obey. He became vain, stubborn, and disobedient. And that's when his life started to change in ways he never imagined. In his stubbornness, Benedito ran away from the farm, thinking he would be free and happy forever. But the freedom he longed for soon turned into a trap. Without the love and protection of the old lady, the donkey faced many dangers and difficulties, until he realized he had made the worst decision of his life. What happened next? Well, I'm not sure if you're ready to know. After all, if you disobey those who love you, something similar might happen to you. If you want to find out how this story ends and learn a lesson that might change your life, subscribe to the channel right now. That way, you won't miss any of our tales, filled with adventures, surprises, and great teachings. Don't miss out on this story. Hit the subscribe button and join us. Once upon a time, on a small farm surrounded by beautiful trees and colorful flowers, there lived a kind old lady named Mrs. Camilla. Everyone in the town knew her for her calm and loving nature, especially when it came to caring for animals. Among all the creatures on her farm, there was one that held a special place in her heart, a little donkey named Benedito, affectionately called Dito. Dito arrived at the farm when he was still very young, and Mrs. Camilla treated him with great care from the very first day. She offered him the best meals, always making sure he had the freshest carrots and the purest water. Every day before the sun set, she would brush Dito's fur until it gleamed under the golden light, and at night, as the stars appeared in the sky, Mrs. Camilla would softly sing so the little donkey could sleep peacefully. She loved him as if he were her own child, and for Dito, the farm was truly a paradise. However, as time passed, Dito grew into a strong and sturdy donkey. His size and strength increased, and with that, a new attitude began to emerge. He was no longer the gentle and humble little donkey he once was. Slowly, Dito's ego grew, and he started to believe he was the king of the farm. Thinking he was the most important creature there, he began to act arrogantly, ignoring Mrs. Camilla's care and guidance. What were once moments of peace and obedience turned into constant mischief and defiance. Dito no longer followed Mrs. Camilla's orders as he used to. He challenged her at every opportunity, thinking he could do everything his way. For him, freedom meant following his own whims. Mrs. Camilla, always patient and loving, tried to correct the donkey's behavior, but it seemed that her words no longer reached Dito's stubborn heart. One day, taking advantage of a moment of distraction, Dito pushed open the stable door with his nose and escaped. Feeling freer than ever, he ran through the fields, jumping and braying, thinking that a life of disobedience was far more exciting. Mrs. Camilla, with her calm demeanor, soon found him eating the neighbor's flowers. Though firm, she used her sweetness to scold Dito and brought him back to the farm. But the donkey no longer felt like he belonged there. He was determined to follow his own path, not realizing that he was distancing himself from the only place where he was truly loved. After that little escape, Benedito's stubbornness only grew. He was no longer the same gentle donkey he once was. Despite Mrs. Camilla's constant patience and kindness, Dito's ego grew bigger and bigger. One day, when the old lady was busy, Benedito escaped from the stable once more. This time, he didn't just want to walk through the fields. Dito decided that he would explore the world beyond the farm's borders. With his nose, he pushed open the stable door again and ran toward the open fields. He jumped, brayed loudly, feeling completely free. The wind blew against his face, and the feeling of not having to obey anyone seemed like true freedom to him. The little donkey felt invincible, as if nothing could stop him. To him, this was the beginning of a life full of adventures, without rules and without anyone to tell him what to do. However, his freedom didn't last long. Soon enough, Mrs. Camilla, with her slow but steady steps, went after him. She found him in the neighbor's garden, devouring the flowers he took such care of. When she saw him, the old lady approached calmly, with a gentle smile but a certain sadness in her eyes. "Benedito, what are you doing here?" she asked softly, but with firmness in her voice. "This isn't right. You can't just leave and cause trouble. Let's go back home." With all her patience, Mrs. Camilla managed to take Dito back to the farm. As they walked back, she spoke to the little donkey, trying to help him understand the importance of respecting the rules and the responsibilities everyone has. She told him that, although he was very dear to her, his stubbornness was pushing him away from those who loved him the most. Dito, for his part, listened in silence, but in his stubborn heart, he didn't want to accept her words. He believed that true happiness was doing whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted. As soon as they arrived at the farm, Mrs. Camilla put him back in the stable, closing the door securely this time. She knew that, despite all the lessons, Benedito had not yet learned the value of everything he had there. To her, that little donkey, as disobedient as he was still special. But deep down, Donna Camilla feared that one day Benedito might decide not to return home anymore. Time passed, and Dito continued with his mischief. He always took advantage of the moments when Donna Camilla wasn't around to plan his little escapes and explore the surroundings. However, he still didn't know that life's real lesson was about to come, and it would be much harsher than he could ever imagine. One day, Benedito decided he wouldn't return home anymore. During one of his escapes, something changed inside him. Instead of obediently coming back when Donna Camilla found him, as he had done so many times before, the stubborn little donkey chose to follow his own path. At that moment, he felt freer than ever, convinced that the farm with its rules and routines was no longer enough for him. Dito wanted more. He wanted to explore the world on his own, without the constraints of obedience and without Donna Camilla's affection, which he now deemed unnecessary. Without looking back, he ran far away, leaping across the fields, moving further and further from the farm. The sun began to set, and the golden light colored the hills around him. For Benedito, this was true freedom. He believed that now he could find everything he had always wanted, far from Donna Camilla and far from the responsibilities he so despised. But as night fell, things started to change. The darkness brought a new feeling. The little donkey began to feel something he didn't know: loneliness. The field, which had once seemed full of adventures, now became silent and cold. To make matters worse, Benedito started to feel hungry. He was used to the fresh carrots and clean water that Donna Camilla always provided for him. But out there, far from the farm, there was nothing in sight to satisfy his hunger. Tired and hungry, Dito spotted a new farm in the distance. He approached, believing that, as always, he would find something to eat. The little donkey, confident and unaware that he was no longer at Donna Camilla's place, tried to get close to the feeding troughs. However, this farm was different. The donkeys who lived there worked hard every day and were not willing to share their food with a stranger. "Get out of here, intruder," the other donkeys brayed, pushing Benedito with their strong bodies. Not understanding, Benedito tried to resist. But soon, the stern farmer of that farm spotted him. With a firm and authoritative voice, he shouted, "If you want to eat, you'll have to work." Unlike Donna Camilla, this man had neither patience nor affection for him. Thus, the little donkey, with nowhere to go and no strength to escape, was forced to work hard. He pulled plows, carried heavy sacks of grain, and hauled water from the well, all from dawn until dusk. Each day was harder than the last. His legs ached, his back was covered in bruises, and he barely received enough food to keep him standing. The freedom Benedito had longed for now seemed like an unbearable burden. The longing for Donna Camilla's farm grew with each passing moment. He missed the songs, the care, and even the small orders she used to give him. But above all, Benedito missed the unconditional love that had always been there, which he, in his stubbornness, had failed to appreciate. The days on the new farm were tough for Benedito. Every dawn, he was forced to do the hardest tasks, carrying heavy sacks, plowing the hard soil, and fetching water from a distant well. The nights weren't any better. He slept on the cold ground, far from the comfort he had at Donna Camilla's home, without warm blankets and without the fresh food he was used to. Little by little, the donkey who once brayed with joy and pride now groaned with exhaustion and sadness. No matter how much Benedito missed his old life, his pride prevented him from admitting that he had made a mistake. "I don't need anyone," he told himself, trying to convince himself that his choice had been the right one. However, each day, the weight of his decisions grew heavier. He could no longer ignore the emptiness he felt when remembering the old farm. The nights spent working and being mistreated made him reflect on what he had lost. He missed Camilla, her affection and patience, but above all, he missed the simplicity of the life he had before deciding to follow his own path. One night, as the moon shone in the sky and the wind gently blew, Benedito had an epiphany. He remembered Camilla's words, the many times she had warned him about the importance of respect and responsibility. With that, he understood the true meaning of freedom. Being free wasn't about doing whatever he wanted, but about valuing those who were by his side and offering love in return for love. He realized he had taken for granted the only person who had always been there for him. With tears in his eyes and a heavy heart, Benedito made the hardest decision of his life. He needed to go back home. But now, the big question was, would he be welcomed back? The little donkey didn't know how Camilla would react to his return. He had abandoned the woman who loved him so much and the farm that had sheltered him. Would it be possible to receive forgiveness after all he had done? With his heart torn between fear and hope, Benedito decided to gather his strength and return home. He knew the road would be long, and his body was weak and sore from the hard work, but the hope of reuniting with Camilla kept him going. As he walked, memories of his old life filled him with regret. He knew he had made a serious mistake, but he was determined to right his wrongs and perhaps receive the forgiveness he so deeply desired. Benedito walked for many days, following the path back to Dona Camilla's farm. He was tired, hungry, and his legs ached with every step. But still he kept going, guided by the hope of seeing the old woman again and maybe earning her forgiveness. As he crossed mountains and hills, the little donkey couldn't stop thinking about everything he had left behind. Why was I so stubborn, he wondered. Regret grew inside him like a shadow that would not leave. After days of traveling, Benedito finally saw the farm where he had been so happy. But something was wrong. The farm he knew, once full of life and joy, now seemed silent and abandoned. The flowers in Dona Camilla's garden were wilted, and the corral gate was open, swinging in the wind. A feeling of emptiness overtook the little donkey. Where could Dona Camilla be? Why did everything seem so different? Benedito brayed as he approached the house, calling for Dona Camilla. But there was no response. He searched everywhere, walking through the familiar corners of the farm, but found no one. The silence was suffocating. Camilla, he called again, this time with a tone of despair in his voice. Only the echo of his bray answered. Something terrible had happened, and Benedito began to feel the weight of his choices more painfully than ever. While exploring the farm, Benedito found something that made him stop abruptly. In the corner of the garden, there was a small grave marked by a simple wooden cross. Wildflowers grew around it, as if nature itself was paying homage to the place. Trembling with fear and sadness, the little donkey approached, and when he looked at the cross, his heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. Engraved on the wood was the name he loved so much, Dona Camilla. At that moment, Benedito fell to his knees, tears streaming from his large, sad eyes. The lady who had loved and cared for him, who never denied him affection and patience, was gone. And he, in his stubbornness, had left her alone, chasing after a false freedom. "Forgive me, dear Camilla," he whispered, his heart heavy with guilt and regret. He had arrived too late. Pride had taken him away from the one who loved him the most, and now, all that was left was the pain of knowing he could never fix his mistake. After spending the night beside Dona Camilla's grave, Benedito was consumed with regret. He knew that his disobedience and pride had driven him away from the person who loved him most. For hours he sat there, recalling every moment of kindness that Dona Camilla had shown him, how she always treated him with patience, even when he misbehaved. The weight of loss was unbearable. The farm, once full of life, now seemed like a place of loneliness and sadness, just like the little donkey's heart. However, Benedito decided that, even though he couldn't undo the past, he could still honor Dona Camilla's memory. He promised himself that he would care for the farm with the same love and dedication that she had always shown. In the days that followed, the little donkey worked tirelessly to restore the place. He tended to the flowers in the garden, kept the corral clean, and made sure that the farm, despite the absence of its owner, remained a place of peace and harmony. The neighbors, seeing Benedito's transformation, were moved. His story of redemption spread throughout the small town, and everyone began to see the little donkey not as the disobedient rebel, but as a symbol of transformation and repentance. Some even started helping Benedito, bringing food and assisting with small repairs on the farm. Though his heart was broken, Benedito was motivated by the memory of Dona Camilla, which gave him the strength to carry on. Months passed, and the farm began to flourish once more. But despite all his efforts, loneliness still weighed heavily on Benedito. He knew that, no matter how much he cared for the farm, nothing would bring Dona Camilla back. On a quiet morning, the neighbors noticed that the farm was quieter than usual. When they approached, they found Benedito lying on the ground next to the grave of his beloved Donna Camilla. He had passed away, his head resting on the earth that covered the lady who had loved him so much. The news of Benedito's death quickly spread through the town, and the townsfolk decided to pay one last tribute to the little donkey who, despite his mistakes, had learned life's hardest lesson, that love and forgiveness are more important than any pride. They planted flowers around the graves of Camilla and Benedito, turning the farm into a small sanctuary of love and redemption. The story of Donna Camilla and Benedito continues to be told as a reminder that it is never too late to seek forgiveness and correct our mistakes.